Greetings and salutations! I'm Janet from World Anvil, and today we're going to talk about how you can create cultures, societies in your world building project. So, we're going to talk about marriages and families, we're going to talk about clans and dynasties, and then we're going to address wider units like tribes and cultures. So hold on to your hats, guys. It's time to light up the forge. Social dynamics are often really overlooked in the art of world building. So why are they so important? Well, the basics of your society are going to have a massive impact on the way your world functions. Whether it's background flavour or main plot conflict, thinking about the way that your cultures work in your world is going to give you a deeper understanding of it on every level. For example, the way your societies function is going to change the way your settlements look. Big families means big houses. Looking deeper into the culture of your world could also tell you things about the history of your society, what kind of conflicts may have been a problem in the past, and what aspects of your culture affect people to this day. Things to think about on that score are things like gender biases, age biases, class and caste biases, or educational biases. If you have multiple cultures interacting, thinking about their own biases is going to tell you a lot about how they interact with one another. Aspects of cultural ideologies also have a huge impact on things like conlangs and religions, so that's a great place to look at the ramifications of your new culture as well. When you're starting with a new culture, it's a good idea to think about the biology of the species that you're dealing with. Although we're not necessarily defined completely by our biology, it is a very good place to start because it introduces necessarily limits and ramifications belonging to all physical bodies. For example, the way children are conceived is going to affect the way that potential parents interact with each other. Aspects like the duration of pregnancy and the length of childhood are necessarily going to affect how family units work. A long childhood might lead to a very close parental bond with the children, whereas a very short childhood, or no childhood, for example if eggs are laid, may lead to less importance on the parent-child relationship within your culture. Lifespan is another aspect that's very important to consider when we begin to think about the culture. Very long lifespans might lead to deeper bonds within family groups, for example. All these aspects have a huge impact on how we relate to one another. And of course, it all starts with making the babies. Procreation is a major biological drive for every species on this planet. It's so important, it causes humans to go to the gym and triple in weight, it causes women to paint their faces and pierce things, it causes animals to go completely crazy and start building things. Procreation is a major drive, people. So when you're thinking about your new culture, it's really important to consider what is required for making babies. Now, I'm not talking about Barry White and a bottle of Prosecco here. I'm talking about the physical things which need to be aligned in order for children to be produced. For example, there might be time constraints. Some animals are not fertile all the time. Dogs, for example, go into season and have a period where they're fertile, and otherwise they are not fertile. You can see this in all sorts of species all over our planet. A great fictional example of this is the Vulcans from Star Trek, who go through what's called pon farr. During this period, they experience an uncontrollable urge to procreate. They get aggressive, their demeanour changes, they lose their grip on logic, and if they don't satisfy this urge, really, really bad things happen, as have been visited in lots of Star Trek episodes. So that's a great example of a sapient species that goes through this kind of mating season, as it were. Another question is how many biological sexes are required to produce a child? There are species on this earth which are hermaphroditic, so that's one avenue to explore. But what if, for example, you had 3 biological sexes in your species, or 5 biological sexes in your species? How many of those are required to make a child, and how does that affect the cultural ramifications of a society at large? Another important question for your society is, what makes an attractive partner? Now, this isn't just as simple as someone being the biggest or the strongest, as we know from our own culture and as we see repeatedly in the animal world. Longest eye stalks, prettiest nest, and shiniest butt are just some examples of how different species on our planet choose their ideal mating partner. Performances are also really common in nature. These might be courtship dances, changing colours, or the love songs of male mice. I kid you not, it's a real thing. They sing, people. It's like Mouse Ballad 2019. Another important aspect to consider when you first start to conceive of your culture is whether it has formalised partnerships or not, things like marriages. This might depend on how long childhood is, or the duration of pregnancy. Children require a lot of looking after, as I'm sure you guys are aware, and the longer that they're reliant on their parent for food and for security, the more demanding it is. Therefore, the more likely it is that there'll be a team behind the parenting of one or more children. Again, in terms of demand, it might be more likely to have a multi-parent family if there are lots of children being produced. It increases the amount of time that a parent has to look after the children, and so more parenting hours are required. Therefore, more people. On the other hand, if you're looking at a short childhood, and, for example, an egg-laying species, single-parent families might be more normal. That's going to affect all sorts of things, like how your cities look, how your conlangs work, and how people view single-parent and multi-parent families. It's also worth considering which of the biological sex or sexes has the babies, and who looks after them. They're not always the same person. Now, the majority of human cultures have the mother being the most important person for the child. After all, they carry the food. The Aka tribe in Africa, though, is a great example of a culture in which men look after the babies quite a lot of the time, whilst the women go out hunting. Men have even been known to breastfeed their babies, that is to say, allow them to suckle on their nipple, when the women are away in order to calm them down. And again, this mother-centric approach to child raising is not always the case in animal species as well. Male seahorses are the obvious example. They both get pregnant and give birth to their young. Penguins and a lot of other birds also take turns in both incubating and feeding their children. Rhea and emu females take this one step further. They mate with a male and then lay eggs, and then they leave the man to look after those eggs and the offspring that come from them, which can take up to 2 years. Meanwhile, they've gone off to mate with another man. I guess that's one way to do it. So these aspects, like how long does it take to raise a child, and who is involved in raising them, are very important when it comes to defining social roles in your society or culture. Longevity and different life stages are major questions that you will need to answer when you start defining these points. When does a child leave their infant or larval form? When does a child hit puberty? Elves, for example, live a hugely long time. Does that mean their puberty is really long? Dear God. Poor elves. Human cultures approach this in all different ways. Sometimes the children are raised by the village, or sometimes only by the couple. Sometimes the nuclear family is involved, and sometimes not. There'll be examples of all sorts of different setups within your world, but defining the cultural norm is going to go a long way in helping you define your culture as a whole. Alright guys, it's time for prompt number 1. We're following a series of prompts in order to build our world from the smallest unit to the largest unit. Get your notebooks ready, or open up a World Anvil page and start making notes. Remember to put your answers in the comments below so we can all share our notes. How does the biology of your sapient species affect the basic family unit? Think about the number of biological sexes and the durations of pregnancy, childhood, and lifespan as a whole. And that leads us to the next question. How big is your family? big are the family units in your culture? Some cultures only reckon on parents, children, and maybe aunts and uncles. Others might keep track of multiple lines of distant cousins and part siblings. There are also different ways to understand relatedness. For example, am I related to my father's cousins or my mother's cousins? Some cultures only understand kinship through the patrilineal line. That is, only people on the father's side are relations. You might also have some aspects of inheritance viewed through the patrilineal line, for example, monetary inheritance, and some aspects of inheritance viewed through the matrilineal line, for example, inheritance of identity or religion. Judaism is a great example of something which is inherited culturally through the matrilineal line. If your mother is Jewish, then you are Jewish. Single lineage inheritance is really common in societies that don't have great records. What that means is that it's easier to keep track of only one line of inheritance than of two. This means that when the families are bigger or more sprawling or with many short generations, you can keep track of them pretty easily. Another important aspect is what the different roles that we understand, like uncle or father, really mean. One of the cultures in Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicles doesn't believe in paternity. They don't think that the father has any role in the procreation of children. This means that there is no father relationship. There is no fatherhood. In some cultures, relations of the same gender on the same genealogical line are considered equivalent. For example, your father is your father, of course, but your father's brother is also your father. The aunt on your father's side may be more or less important than the aunt on your mother's side. The oldest or the youngest child may hold some special significance. All these kinds of relationship quirks add a rich and varied nature to your culture and also will define all sorts of very subtle social strata and cues within the family unit. It's going to change how people relate to one another on a fundamental level. And speaking of what we owe to one another, let's talk about honour codes and moral codes. Honour codes and moral codes, what we owe to each other and especially to members of our family, are really important for defining cultural boundaries. These can take a lot of different forms. For example, you look after your parents when they're elderly, but what about your father's parents or your husband's parents? Are they also bound to you in that way? And how far out do those obligations stretch? Another really important thing to consider is the incest taboo. Now, this is a real thing and it's really important. For example, obviously I can't marry my brother, but can I marry my cousin? In Jane Austen's day, that was completely normal and acceptable. In fact, it was often desirable as a way of keeping the wealth within the family. Different cultures treat this in different ways. For example, in Muslim law, if a woman became a widow, her brother-in-law would be obliged to marry her in order to look after her. In Christian law, a woman could not marry their brother-in-law under any circumstances. In fact, that's part of what kicked off the whole Henry VIII disaster. These are very opposite attitudes which persist even until today to the same issue. So how is your culture going to deal with them? Another question is, to whom do you owe your allegiance? To your own family or to the family you've married into? Even today, in some cultures, a woman owes allegiance not to her father's family, but to her father-in-law's family once she's become married. She cooks for them, she works for them, she looks after them, and not for her own family. And finally, how does inheritance work in your culture? This might be different at different periods of time, because inheritance is about laws as well as about cultures. So it's one to think about quite carefully. Rules of inheritance mould how families grow and develop. Families will often restrict the number of children they have so that the family wealth is not parcelled up in packets that are too small. Historically, it was very common that the second son and the third son would not be allowed to marry. They might be sent off to have professions rather than allowed to settle down and have a marriage and an estate of their own. Again, this was to prevent the family wealth from being divided up too much. The idea was to keep all the money together so the family remained prestigious throughout the generations. extra daughters might be given a dowry, but often they were encouraged to remain unmarried or go off into convents. Another solution from ancient Greece was to marry nieces and uncles, again, thereby keeping the wealth within the close family unit. The technicalities of the inheritance within your laws and within your culture is going to affect these kinds of decisions within your cultures. For example, is it the oldest child who inherits everything, or the oldest son? Can women inherit? Do they inherit exclusively? And how are items divided between the genders, however many you have of them? For example, in certain times and in certain places in history, women could inherit some things, whilst men inherited other things. On the islands in ancient Greece, for example, it was very common that men would inherit the land, but the women would inherit the houses. This means that get out of my house was not just a figure of speech. There may be specific divisions in who can inherit which items, and it's really important to think about that in advance, because that tells you a lot about who has control of what. These kinds of inheritance questions are, ironically, most important for people who are actually wealthy, who've got stuff. Amongst the poor in almost all cultures and histories, these things are less important. Nobody cares who gets the stuff because there is no stuff. So these rules might govern the family formations of your wealthiest and most prestigious families in your culture, but remember, they may not apply to everyone. Alright guys, it's time for prompt number 2 now, so crack open your World Anvil page and let's get writing. Remember to put your answers in the comments below so we can all share our notes. How big is the typical close family? Is kinship judged through the matrilineal, patrilineal, or some other way? How does inheritance work in your culture? I've broken this video into 2 parts so that it's a little bit easier to follow and a little bit easier to track. Check out our YouTube channel, that's youtube.com/worldanvil to find the second part, or it should be linked in this video as well. Make sure you tune in so that you can answer the other prompts and learn more about world building social dynamics. But for now, grab your hammer and go world build! Oh lordy, lord. Ooh. These might be marriages for life, or they could be something else. Oh, hello, cat. No, you can't come here. No. Ah, your timing is impeccable, you small beast. I am not feeling social with making the babies. Babies.